Just stay seated.
All right, we're ready to go ahead and get started. If I could have everyone's attention, please. Thank you all for coming out here today. So my name is Vic Wang. I'm the president of Humanists of Houston. Today's event is a collaboration between Humanists of Houston, the Southeast Texas Humanist Alliance, Lamar University Secular Student Alliance, and Humanists of Houston. So today we feature representatives from the Freedom from Religion Foundation, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and the Foundation for Contemporary Theology. So over the past few, oh, by the way, and there's information about all the different organizations out at the table out front, brochures and various literature. So over the past few years, there's been an increased interest from national organizations such as the Freedom from Religion Foundation at the request of local residents regarding separation of church and state issues in school districts, the school districts of Southeast Texas. Church and state concerns have been raised in Kuntz, Beaumont, China, Sour Lake, and other local communities, where unfortunately some of the actions of those in the public school system crossed constitutional boundaries. But as unfortunate as those incidents were, also unfortunate is how these concerns have resulted in a great amount of confusion, hostility, and tension in the local community. Especially as certain public officials, and even local media have made misstatements regarding the nature of the FFRF's involvement with these issues, as well as regarding the actions of local activists, such as Beaumont resident Amber Barnhill, who is here in attendance today.
Last year was my kids' first year in this district. They were in preschool and first grade. And the first day of school, I looked on the website looking for information, and what I saw was post after post after post about teachers preaching to the students. They listed at least 12 different local clergy members who came on campus to preach to the students. They were handing out Bibles. One student won Hawk of the Week because he, quote, prays for his teachers. And it was just, the year before that I'd complained, and I was a Christian at that point, and it was just one little mild thing, and it was just all this backlash, and I told myself I was never going to do it again. But then when I moved here, it was just so much. There was crosses in the classroom walls. The Christian students were getting special privileges to go on these little field trips during the day, and, like prayers at the board meetings, prayers at the school graduations, prayers at the football games. It was just everywhere, and so I couldn't not complain. It was too much. And so I did it anonymously, and I had two other parents in the district do a news report with me, and we all did it anonymously. One of them, her neighbor, found out who she was because she had a tattoo on her hand, and they outed her, and she got accused that they were going to call CPS on her. She had pulled her kids out and were homeschooling her kids, but I don't have that choice. Not everybody has that option, and so
to flee from society.
Right, and you shouldn't have to make that choice, but even if I could, I couldn't do that.
So the purpose of today's event is to dispel misconceptions, gain accurate information about the FFRF's ongoing involvement in Southeast Texas school districts, and to discuss local and legal policies surrounding religion in public schools. We hope this meeting will help to empower local families with knowledge so that they'll have a clearer understanding of their religious rights and freedoms under the law and under the Constitution. Also, before we begin our program today, please remember that there are a wide range of beliefs and worldviews being represented here today, both on the panel and among our audience. And we expect everyone to be respectful of each other's personal and religious views accordingly. We wish to make it very clear that this event is specifically to address legal issues regarding separation of church and state, and not to address any topics of a theological or philosophical nature. Also, during the audience Q&A, we do expect everyone present to conduct themselves with respect and decorum. Any outbursts, disruptions, off-topic discussions, or personal attacks will not be tolerated. And in the event of sustained disruptions, we will have no choice but to ask any such individuals to leave. Also, please be mindful that with this very small room here, We can kind of hear what everybody's saying, so please keep any kind of side chatter to a minimum as well. Also, finally, before we begin, we would like to give thanks to Mayor John Walker of China, Texas, for generously allowing us to use this facility, and for being very accommodating to our needs during the preparation for this event, which we hope will provide valuable information to the local community and foster a greater understanding between those who may hold different worldviews, but hopefully can find common understanding going forward regarding issues of separation of church and state. So, we'll begin with the opening statements from each of our panelists here today. So we will be going from my left to right, starting with Mr. Bob Tucker, who is the Executive Director Emeritus of the Foundation for Contemporary Theology. He has served churches in South Dakota, Minnesota, Texas, and Kansas, and he was, for 28 years, the Senior Minister of First Congregational Church of Houston. He taught for 5 years in Turkey and has taught at the University of Minnesota, Rice University School of Continuing Studies, the Women's Institute, and in churches of 6 denominations. He has also been the Director of Library Services and on the faculty of the Houston Graduate School of Theology, and he became the Foundation's Executive Director in 2001. In retirement, Bob additionally serves on the boards of City of Houston, Spring Branch Civic Association, Justice for Children, and Americans United for Separation of Church and State. So please welcome our first panelist, Bob Tucker.
Let me say a brief word about the Foundation for Contemporary Theology. It's a Houston-based organization, and it was founded by an Episcopal priest who was something of a renegade and never found a place in the structures of the Episcopal Church. And he was also very liberal in his beliefs, and so we started this organization. If I had to define it, and I'm defining it in my own terms, it's very difficult almost to define anything these days, that when it comes to the Bible, we really are not literalist, that when it comes to belief, we're not dogmatist, that when it comes to people, we're not exclusivist. And a number of organizations could be saying the same thing as well. I do want to just lay out some of my basic feeling about church and state, because I run into this a lot in terms of people. Actually, I seek out conversations with people of the religious right. I think that if they want to intrude themselves on me, I have a right to reverse that and to try and stir up in their own minds a little different understanding as well. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights mentions religion twice, and both times it says no. No religious test for any public office, and no establishment of religion. There's one other place in the Constitution where it goes contrary to this idea that somehow we're a Christian nation or we were founded as a Christian nation, and that's in the absence of the word God. At the very beginning, we, who founds this country? We, the people of the United States of America, do ordain and establish this Constitution. That was quite a radical way of looking at governing bodies, because just a few years before, in the Treaty of Paris that brought to an end the Revolutionary War, it begins in the name of the Blessed Trinity. And so to remove that kind of religious language from the beginning of a treaty was quite radical. We, the people, established this country. We are not a Christian nation, we're not a religious nation.
And so they figured out who I was. It's a small town. I don't know these people, but apparently they know me on site. Even if I see them in the grocery store, they know who I am right away. The principal sent a letter to the parents and the students telling them that I was trying to cease all spiritual activity on all campuses, both before and after school, which, in fact, the only thing we complained about was the teachers leading the students, not anything the students were actually doing. I feel like I'm actually pretty tolerant to religious people being religious. It's just, you overstep a boundary. And so she sent this letter out, and in the letter it said that we, quote, intend to harm them. And so all of the parents and the students, and they all had this idea that I was trying to hurt them. They made 3 T-shirts and lanyards just for me, and I have a screenshot of a Sour Lake Elementary School teacher saying, "Look at these shirts we made just for you," and it has a Bible verse on it about standing against your enemy. One of the 4th grade science teacher has been getting. They made a private Facebook group for the Christian parents and students in the school. And I have a screenshot of them talking about making this group. And if you go to the group, the 4th grade science teachers, and they're repeatedly posting how we're the enemy, how I hate them, how I intend to harm them, and I'm attacking them. And just, it's just over the top.
All right, so that brings us to our next panelist, who is Dan Barker, co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, author, and musician. Dan received a degree in religion from Azusa Pacific University and was ordained to the ministry in 1975, serving as a preacher and musician for 19 years. He has appeared on dozens of national television and radio shows to discuss and debate secular issues such as Hannity and Holmes, Good Morning America, Phil Donahue, and Sally Jesse Raphael. So please welcome our second panelist, Dan Barker.
Thank you, Vic, and thank you, City of China, for this invitation. I told the attorneys yesterday at our office that I was going to be speaking in China tomorrow night. I said, whoa, how's long flight, isn't it? And they, I even understand some Texas don't even know where China, Texas is. So this is pretty amazing. You're on the map now, so that's, yeah. So the Freedom from Religion Foundation is in Madison, Wisconsin. We're a national organization of free thinkers, mainly atheists and agnostics, and we don't care what people call themselves, secular humanists, or one guy calls himself an igtheist, and we don't care. What we like to say is we all disbelieve in the same God, no matter what we call ourselves. So we do not roam the country looking for violations of state-church separation. We get accused of that a lot. The Freedom from Religion Foundation is roaming the country trying to interfere with religious freedom. We don't have to roam the country. It's people like Amber who call us up and say, help! They're interfering with my family's religious views. What can I do about that? Often they're not as brave as Amber. Often they have to keep their heads down and they can't even be named. They can't even be known in that community as one of the few people who object to the religious status quo. So we represent non-believers in all 50 states who want to keep religion and government separate, and who want to educate the public about the views of those of us who don't believe. I used to be a Christian minister. I used to believe with all my heart. I used to preach the gospel. I loved it, and I reluctantly gave it up when I discovered for myself that it's just not true. Other Americans have different opinions. Other Americans are Muslim. Some are Hindu. I debated a Hindu Vedic astrologer a year ago who was convinced that he has a personal relationship with Shiva. So this, there are Christians, there are Catholics, there are whatever. This is a great country, and like Bob said, our Constitution did something unique in history. Whereas most constitutions and most governments were established under some authority up here, like the church or the monarchy or some higher authority from which our rights come. What we did in this country is we took it and did it like this and said, we the people. Nobody is less and nobody is more in this country. We are not a classist country. Nobody has a higher level. We call our president Mr. President. Although I still think a lot of people want to harken back to the days of the monarchy, and we still have this sort of celebrity worship with people who are leaders. But in America, we're all the same. That one atheist kid in the classroom is just as important as the majority Christian kids that are in the classroom. That one Muslim girl who's sitting in the class is just as much an American, just as important. Her views are just as important on the table as anyone else's views. So in this country, we fight for equality and for fairness. And our organization, we've taken maybe almost 70 lawsuits now since we were founded. We don't sue individuals. We don't challenge anybody's right to believe or disbelieve. We don't barge into churches and say, how can you be so dumb to believe in this spook and that? We don't do that. We respect religious freedom. Even though we have personal views, some of us think that Jesus was not a great moral example, for example. And his picture should not be on the wall in Chanute, Kansas Middle School. It should be on the wall of a church. The Ten Commandments in a school in Pennsylvania should not be right by the front door as the high school students come in. In fact, we just won that lawsuit, and they just removed that 1950s Eagles Ten Commandments monument from the school ground reluctantly. They didn't want to remove it, but the court told them, look, this is unconstitutional. So we don't sue individuals, we sue governments. And like Bob said, religion in the Constitution is exclusionary. The only references to it are exclusionary. Religion, however, is a very special thing in this country. Religion is very important. It's so important that our Constitution mentions it. If a high school teacher gets up and says, Coca-Cola is better than Pepsi. Nobody should drink Pepsi. Coca-Cola is better. Well, that's free speech, right? The students can ignore it. The students can say, okay. If a high school principal gets up and said, we all need to have solidarity and we all need to root for what's the team? The Houston Texans, right? We all need to root for that team. This is the team I think we all should root for. Anyone who roots for any other team is second class. Well, that's free speech, right? The students can agree or ignore or whatever. That's free speech. But if anybody in the government at any level, and high school teachers are the government, if they got up and said, born-again Protestants are really the real Americans and Catholics are second class. We'll tolerate them, but they're second class. That is unconstitutional. Why? What's the difference? Why is it free speech in one case but not in another? It's because in our Constitution, we don't have the separation of sports and government. We don't have the separation of soft drinks and government, but we do have specifically the separation of religion and government. Religion is a special thing. It's a thing that's pointed out in our Constitution. The First Amendment, which delineates, the First Amendment doesn't give us our rights. Our government is not handing us our rights. We have them inherently. The First Amendment acknowledges our rights, and those 5 freedoms are collectively sometimes known as freedoms of conscience: speech, press, assembly, to petition the government, and religion. Before those 5 freedoms are specified in our First Amendment, first there's a non-freedom. Not for us people, not for we the people, but the government. We the people have freedom, the government does not. So when you're looking at any of these potential violations of church-state separation in your town or your community, ask yourself a simple question. Is this free speech or is this government speech? Because if it's government speech, the government doesn't have free speech. The government hands are tied. The government has to be neutral. Because if the government interferes, it's like why some of the original religious colonists came to this country, to escape governmental interference with private religious views. There's that old joke that the Puritans loved religious freedom so much that they kept it all to themselves. But they came to escape this big government interfering with religious views, and yet some of them still think that our country is a Christian country where the government does have the right to inflict the views of the majority on the minority. So the First Amendment, we think, is a beautiful document, a beautiful part of our country that protects all of us, whether we believe or not. And you can't have religious freedom if you don't have the freedom to dissent. You can't say yes if you can't say no. So the tens of millions of us who dissent from religion are just as American, just as patriotic, just as moral, just as family-loving, just like anyone else. We are equal citizens, and we don't like being treated like we're second class because we're not part of the majority. Sometimes we have to complain about teachers bullying students who don't go along with the majority view. So to be a true American, we must all be equal. We must respect a strict wall of separation between church and state.
And then at the book fair last year, they had a table just with Christian books. And I sent a picture to Hamont, and he posted about it. I didn't think it was illegal. I just was more making fun of them because they were being passive aggressive about it. And so he posted, and someone saw it and told someone and told someone, and someone on the school board found out, and the principal went in the middle of the night and made them pull all the Christian books out of the entire school library, even though nobody had actually complained. So the next morning I get a phone call from a local reporter asking if I'll make a statement about having the Christian books pulled. And I was like, what are you talking about? And I mean, I almost didn't even believe that had actually happened. Like that just sounds crazy. Like who does that? And so I went to the campus, and apparently it was true. She thought it was me because there were Facebook rumors all over the whole town that I had forced all of the Christian books out of the whole library. Anything mentioning Easter or Christmas or God or Jesus or creation, that I made them pull all of those books out. And it's funny that he actually did pull all the Christian books just based on a rumor.
And that brings us to our third panelist, David Furlow, who serves on the board of directors of the Houston chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, as well as the board of trustees of the Texas Supreme Court Historical Society. He has also served as the executive editor of the Texas Supreme Court Historical Society Journal throughout the 4 years since former State Bar of Texas President Lynn Liberato, and he organized the journal in 2011. So please welcome panelist David Furlow.
Amber, citizens of China, thank you for inviting me here today. I am one of those harmless drudges who studies history so that we may learn from the lessons of the past and hopefully avoid making them again. As a member of the board of directors of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, I have taken on the task at different times, and as executive editor of the Texas Supreme Court Historical Society, I've taken on the task of actually investigating the history of the separation of church and state, and I presented a paper on the history of school prayer litigation at the Texas State Historical Association's annual meeting this past March in Corpus Christi. But I've litigated those issues and issues of First Amendment rights throughout Texas courts, to the Texas Supreme Court and to the U.S. Supreme Court, to tell people that separation of church and state is that element of American civilization tracing itself back to the 17th century founding of this nation that, if anything, makes the United States unique as a forerunner amongst nations of the world. Because it was in the 17th century that Roger Williams, who started out as a law clerk to Attorney General Coke, Edward Coke of Britain, that he first penned a charter of rights that guaranteed absolute freedom of conscience, whether to the Puritan, the Catholic, the Episcopalian, the Muslim, then referred to as the Turk, the Indian, or to people who had no religious faith, to familist, to congregationalist, to one and all, back in the Charter of Rhode Island and Providence Plantation. First drafted in the years after he had convinced Oliver Cromwell's Parliament to permit the experiment of people creating their own little mini republic in those wild forested lands of America. Now, what I have seen over the years is that separation of church and state is not, as some people on the right wing have said, an opponent of religion. We in this nation have had separation of church and state as at the national level since 1789. Yet, as opposed to all of those European nations and others that have compelled their citizens to pay taxes to support a church or a mosque or some other religious institution, we, through the founders, created a marketplace of ideas where people can freely search for their spiritual health, for their religion or non-religious institution. And as a result of that, you can point out, you can examine the polls that show that there are more churches and more fervor and more religious activity in America than in any other Western nation of the world. And I submit it is because in America we do not have the government knuckling us under and compelling us to pay taxes. In fact, we celebrate every Thanksgiving separation of church and state because it was the Pilgrims themselves who dared separate from that kingdom of King James, whose Bible he created with the power of the state, in order to compel people to obey the rule of their bishops and their king, combining state and church, in order to create a power which, according to Roger Williams, corrupted both. And whether it be Roger Williams fearing the corruption of inherent association with the state on the church, or Thomas Jefferson fearing the corruption of the church and what he viewed as superstition on the state. One thing or another, we know that the state that separates the church from government, or the mosque from government, or the temple from government, is the one that minimizes that inherent tendency of human beings to use the power of the state in order to compel other people to surrender their conscience and their religious ideas. So I encourage you to find out more about Americans United for Separation of Church and State, to consider joining. It is an organization founded and headed by Reverend Barry Lynn, an ordained minister. It is not opposed to religion in public life. It is opposed to government's attempt to corrupt religion in religious life. I had this in my own blood. One of my ancestors, Reverend John Lothrop, refused to accept the King James Bible in England. He, for that, was thrown in that institution known as the Clink, which was a jail over in London. His wife died while he was in prison. His children were reduced to begging for bread on the streets of London. When he got out of prison, he left the Archbishop Reverend Laud's England to come, and Charles I's England to come to America and to settle near Cape Cod in Barnstable. I have seen his Bible, a 1588 Bishop's Bible there. He adhered to the Bishop's Bible and refused to accept the King James Bible. For that, he believed in the separation of church and state, and exiled himself to America to stand up for principles where he ended up in opposition to his fellow Puritans, because he said, we have no right to compel the conscience of others. Now, with respect to Texas, I've talked about the history of church-state separation, but I will agree with our other panelists here. In America, the Constitution does not compel belief in a God or creation of a national religious institution. In fact, the United States, under its second president, John Adams, entered into a treaty with the Barbary pirates of the Tripolitan area of what is now Tunis. And in the Treaty of Tripoli, the United States ambassador entered into an agreement that said that the United States could enter into an enforceable treaty with a Muslim nation, because America was not a nation, not a Christian nation, but a nation of law. And that treaty was signed by John Adams, Congregationalist and one of the founders of the American Revolution. And it was ratified by the Fourth Congress of the United States, many of whose members had fought in the American Revolution. And its words are that America is not a Christian nation, but a nation under law, therefore one able to enter into an enforceable treaty with people of religions other than Christianity, with Muslims. And I would submit that is the unique thing, the first thing about America, that America dared become a true nation under law rather than under an established church. Therefore, when you celebrate Thanksgiving this year, think about those separatists who had the courage to separate from a combined church and state, to cross the ocean, some of whom oppressed their fellow colonists, but some of whom voted in 1643 for complete religious freedom in Plymouth Colony, a vote that passed by a majority until it was pocket vetoed by Governor William Bradford, the communitarian governor of the colony. And what I would submit to you then is that there is nothing more American than supporting the separation of church and state as the fundamental foundation of our religious and other freedoms. We can talk about these things later on tonight. I love the history of separation of church and state, and that's why I'm proud to be on the board of directors of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Houston. Thank you.
But it's not funny that I went on campus and was like walking the Green Mile because of the teachers gossiping about me, and then I go in the library with my 5 and 7-year-old, and a lady in a Hawks for Christ shirt comes up and verbally attacks me in front of my own children, telling me that my whole family needs help and that we have problems, and right in front of the school librarian, because she's the one that instigated this rumor. And so it's just become this huge problem. And 4 and 5 and 6-year-old students are walking around with T-shirts calling me the enemy, and you have a principal and teachers that are literally teaching the students to bully each other. And so the book fair situation was the last straw. I wrote an open letter to the district. I cited the Freedom from Religion Foundation letters that actually said if the students want to organize a Christian club, let them do it on their own terms. You know, they're not trying to kick God out of the school. And I went and spoke at the school board meeting, and I made them put the letter on record. And one of the board members' responses was, you know, we appreciate her taking the time, and she was very professional, but the club is student-led now. And student-led to them means they give the football players and cheerleaders special privilege to go to the elementary during breakfast time from 7:30 to 8 to preach to the students and give them Bible verses to memorize and use the gym and sound system and so forth. And I've had a conversation with the superintendent specifically in an email citing the school board policy that says that it can only be led by students of that campus, to which of course he ignores.
Before we get to the audience question and answer, just a few questions of a more general nature that's open to all of the panelists. To start us off, what does this Constitution say regarding the separation of church and state? One argument that you will sometimes hear is that, oh, well, it doesn't specifically have those words in the Constitution, and that it only pertains to laws passed by Congress, as opposed to all of these other aspects that are generally considered to fall under the umbrella of separation of church and state. So how would you respond to that particular argument?
Should we go down the line?
However you like.
Well, okay, we hear it all the time. The phrase separation of church and state is not in the Constitution, so we're just making stuff up. In spite of the fact that Thomas Jefferson used that phrase when he was explaining the First Amendment, which among other things was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. And I guess here in China we could call it the Great Wall of separation between church and state. But just because that phrase doesn't appear there doesn't mean that that doesn't represent a well-established constitutional principle. The phrase right to privacy is not in the Constitution. The phrase interstate commerce is not in the Constitution. How many churches have you driven by? Trinity Baptist Church, Trinity United Methodist. The word Trinity, which represents a well-established, with some debate of course, an established biblical principle, the word Trinity does not appear in the Bible. Did you know that? Should Christians stop using the word Trinity because it's not in their founding document? They would say it represents what the document says. So the separation of church and state is a phrase that the courts have consistently used, bouncing off of Thomas Jefferson, who was writing to Baptists, by the way, who were asking him about these, about what this actually meant. So it's here to stay. It's a good phrase. The First Amendment does start with the word Congress, but the 14th Amendment applied the First Amendment to all levels of government, including to the states. So right-wingers cannot say that since the First Amendment uses the word Congress, it only applies to congressional action, because that was the word they were using at that time to refer to the government. So from the White House, from the Capitol, all the way down to the high school teacher, we all honor the special American principle of separation of church and state.
Okay.
You can't find any more authentic source for what American liberty is than in the writings of Thomas Jefferson, who penned the Declaration of Independence in 1776, faced the loss of his property and potentially the loss of his life for leading the revolutionary movement, and then stood up to the right-wing religious bigots of his day in the election of 1800 and won. And in his letter to the Danbury Baptist Church in 1801, he defended and explained the American Constitution as having created a wall of separation between the church and the state. That concept was not unique to Jefferson, because as we know, John Adams had in 1797, 3 years before that election, signed that Treaty of Tripoli, saying that the United States is not a Christian nation, and a treaty ratified unanimously by the Senate, who, if they thought that was wrong, would have had every incentive to stand up and say, no, that this is a false statement. But they ratified it. It became a treaty. It was also consistent with what George Washington said at the Truro Synagogue in Rhode Island in 1789 when he said that this Constitution will protect the sons of Abraham as much as it will protect any of my Christian colleagues. And so right there in that trinity of Adams, Jefferson, and Washington, a strong commitment to separation of church and state from the very beginning of this country. It is a part of American society. And even more so in Texas, where the settlers, not just the Anglo settlers, but Tejanos like Lorenzo de Zavala, signed the Texas Declaration of Independence and the Texas Constitution. And those made it clear that Texans had not a negatively phrased right as the federal citizens did, not Congress shall make no law, but all citizens have the right to worship Almighty God as they wish. All citizens have absolute freedom of speech to talk about any subject they wish. No institution shall be used to fund the creation of a national church. And why? Because people like Sam Houston and Lorenzo de Zavala and Stephen F. Austin and the other founders of modern Texas knew that they had suffered under a Mexican state authority that had combined church and state to compel people to become Catholics or to exclude them from public life. So I would submit to you separation of church and state is fundamentally American and fundamentally Texan.
Right?
Yeah. I'm a little uneasy with the phrase, although it's the common phrase and I use it all the time myself. Jefferson did write that, but I don't think it played much play in American jurisprudence until Justice Black used it, I believe, in the 1940s. And then it suddenly became more visible and more prominent. The metaphor itself puts up a rigid wall. And the Constitution doesn't do that. It says that Congress shall not establish a religion, but it also goes on in that First Amendment to say that Congress shall not abridge the free exercise thereof. So there's a protective quality in the Bill of Rights about religion as well as a separation. And I think that always ought to be kept in mind so that we don't be led down a path that there is this rigid division between the two. Now, having said that, I think we're far better off by maintaining a fairly rigid division. But the government doesn't have a right either, according to the Constitution, the framers, to denigrate religion, to dismiss religion. And we're a couple of hundred years after the Constitution, and we're still having law cases on what this means. And we're going to continue to because the framers of the Constitution were trying to write a document that satisfied the South as well as the North, the different colonies, landowners as well as people who were in business. And they had a lot of compromises. Slavery was one compromise. And the wording of the First Amendment is also one of those compromises. And because it was a compromise that wasn't definitively defined one way or the other, we're going to continue to have an ongoing debate on just the role of religion in American life.
All right, thank you. And so our next question, and I know this may sound like it's tailored specifically for Dan, but it's actually open to all of the panelists, is that another argument that you will sometimes hear is that freedom of religion does not include freedom from religion, that it only protects those who are religious. So how would you all respond to that particular claim?
Well, since our group is called Freedom from Religion Foundation, I'll go first. We use that phrase two different ways. The Freedom from Religion Foundation is an organization of individuals who are, in their personal lives, free from religion. So we are atheists, agnostics, non-believers, a huge chunk of society. In fact, the non-religious is the fastest growing segment of the American demographic religious society right now. And whether you call yourself atheist, secular, humanist, agnostic, whatever, if we consider ourselves a group, we're like the second largest denomination in the country if we were a united group. So we are here. So millions of good Americans who pay taxes, who, my dad was a police officer. They serve in the military. We just erected a Atheist in Foxhole monument in our national headquarters, honoring the atheists and agnostics who have proudly served our country in the nation's wars. And so there are Americans who are free from religion in their personal lives, and our government allows that. You can be free. And Ann Gaylor, our principal founder, said you can't have religious freedom if you don't have the freedom to dissent. So that's one thing. But we also think the phrase freedom from religion applies to our government itself, that our government at all levels should be free from religion. Government as government. Of course, people in the government are individuals and they have their views. They can go to church and they can advertise for their faith. But when the school bell rings and that high school teacher walks in the door, as a high school teacher, they have to hang their private religious views on the door and represent all Americans, not just their own particular faith. So our government must be free from religion, although, as Bob said, there's a little bit of wiggle room in the joints, as the courts have talked about. For example, the government can acknowledge religion, and the government can sometimes accommodate religion, as long as the government has a secular purpose in doing so. So we think, and in some languages, I talked in Guatemala last summer about freedom from religion, and in Spanish you can't make a distinction. That word from and of is the same word. So how do you call our group the Freedom from Religion Foundation when it's the same word, freedom of or freedom from? So we have to phrase it in a totally different way. So we think it's the same thing. We think the Establishment Clause guarantees freedom from religion, and the Free Exercise Clause guarantees freedom of religion.
Okay. Would either of y'all like to answer that question?
I think that keeping this distinction, let me go back to start with the original question. Indeed, I don't think you can have a freedom if you wall off a certain part of it and say, well, you're free to believe, but you're not free to not believe. It just doesn't make sense. Having this basic understanding, though, does involve some problems for us as a culture and as a nation. Let me just go to the nation. There are I don't know of another society in the world, although there probably are, there is one or two, where there is this separation of church and state, or of religion and state. I lived in a Muslim country for 5 years, and the idea that somehow you could wall off Islam from the government or from the culture, it just doesn't make any sense. And so what we have here is quite unique, but because of that, I think it involves us in some very unfortunate foreign excursions, because we keep trying to say, well, this is the right way. You have to, separation of church and state almost becomes a dogma, and you have to follow that if you're going to be a modern nation. And consequently, I think we run into some strong difficulties of that. I'm wandering a little into the foreign affairs, but what we do here does have consequences in other parts of the world.
And I have to agree with Dan that the Constitution means freedom from religion. Freedom through the Establishment Clause means we are free from having the government tax us and impose upon us an established church or religious body. Freedom of religion is the freedom to practice our religion, spirituality, or choice not to practice religion or spirituality, which is an essential part of our liberty. When I've heard people express the statement that America is a Christian nation and that is a fundamental aspect of it, and the founders intended that because the founders came from a Christian background or attended Christian churches or made Christian statements, that they intended these liberties to be used only by Christians, and that is it is false from their own writings. There was a wide diversity of views. Some of them were theists of one sort or another. Benjamin Franklin at one point contemplated that the solar system was the creation and domain of an evil god who was under the thumb and supervision of a universal God. That Thomas Jefferson was skeptical of all forms of organized religion. George Washington spoke not of God but of providence, that of providence bringing forth the United States. And there were people at that time, let us remember, who did scoff at religion, who were dissenters, and they had a fundamental role to play in creating the American Revolution and American society, one of whom was Thomas Paine, born in Norfolk, England, in Norwich there. There's a monument to him to his day, a man who fired off two revolutions, the American Revolution in that winter of our despair of 1776. His common sense energized the American Revolution. And yet he was a man who attacked what he saw as the arbitrary notions of divine power because they supported the rights of kings. And he had a second chance to prove that during the French Revolution when he penned The Rights of Man, challenging both religious authority and political authority. So this concept of questioning authority that we see occasionally on bumper stickers now is not some new bumper sticker device, but something that goes back to some of the people who helped shape our laws, our constitutions, and fundamentally our liberties.
Let me say something. I think there's a confusion too in the use of words. We are not a country of that has a Christian government, but I think for most of the history of this country, we have been a Christian nation. Not that all people are Christians, but there has been a patina of Christianity over the whole culture. I think just one simple example, since we're in a schoolhouse here, why do we have vacations at Christmas and at Easter? I mean, so that Christian overview has sort of infused our culture. I think I'm not too bothered by saying that in the past we have generally been a Christian nation. We're not a Christian government. What has changed, in my mind, is that since the Second World War, we really have become a much more diverse culture. And in that diversity, we can continue to say we're not a Christian government, but I think that it's getting increasingly difficult to speak of this as a Christian nation. We've just got too much diversity in it today. And now we have to live with that. And it seems to me one of the reasons why there is so much controversy or conflict in our communities is that we're making that leap now from sort of a Christian in a broad sense, Christian undergirding to one where it's being removed. And a lot of people are just not happy with it. But it's a fact today, and it's going to be an increasing fact in the coming future.
And I've got one other thing to say about that. To my mind, we've been talking about a Christian nation and Christianity as if it was monolithic. This brings me back to watching painfully Bill O'Reilly complain about the war on Christians, and specifically the war on Christmas on one of his programs about 5 years ago, when he asked, who began the war on Christmas? And I'll tell you the answer, I do know that. It's Governor William Bradford of the Plymouth Plantation in 1620, because when he was out there in 1621 on Christmas Day, which Puritans did not celebrate because they believed it was a papist superstition, he went out there, and when the various members of the Anglicans amongst them were saying, this is Christmas Day, I don't have to work, he went there and noticed that they were playing ball in the streets of Plymouth, etc., and he essentially kicked their butts into the fields, saying, you're going to work on Christmas, this is just the day in which the Romans celebrated their own holiday, in which Saturnalia, and that it has no meaning. And if you look in the Bible, he said, you will see that there is no Christmas Day. It does not have divine ordination. It is not authentic. And so I make that point only to point out that those folks that there is no monolithic Christianity, that the Puritans had a very different concept of Christianity than their Anglican cousins down in Virginia, and that Roger Williams, founder of the Baptist Church in Rhode Island in 1639, also wrote in his book about religious persecution, published in London in 1644, that the very first group of people who are persecuted when the state exercises the power to support religion, the very first group is always fellow Christians, Christians of a different view. The second group is Jews. And I think that if we look back over history, going back to the Christianization of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD, we would find that is exactly the case. Once the legionaries were with their spears enforcing the decrees of Caesar, the first group they went after were the Donatist Christians in North Africa, who had a different view from the Bishop of Rome. And so it has been then, and so it is now. And so I would say to my Christian friends that if you combine church and state, as some of them wish to do, in this revivalist movement, then the very first group of people who will pay the price will be your fellow Christians.
And so that's basically how we ended up here. And I just, I feel like if we do end up going to court over it, I'm doing my part. I've given them every opportunity that I possibly can to find out what's legal and what's not, to find out what's actually being complained about. And so at this point, I've exhausted, all of my efforts to do this. And if they haven't figured it out by now, then it's not my responsibility anymore, it's theirs.